So the book of Exodus picks up a few hundred years after Genesis ends. So following the prequel, we now begin to learn Israel's story and what God was planning with them. This book tells of Israel's deliverance from slavery in Egypt and why they were in slavery, and their covenant or contractual commitment they made to God, including what he now asks of them. As far as authorship, you can see the same thoughts on Genesis. It's very similar. The date, it covers time from Joseph's death, 1600 BC-ish, somewhere to 1200. We're not completely sure. But the bigger idea, though, is what is the theme or ideas you want. So what I want to do to start our study of Exodus is to give you some big ideas to keep in mind. So as you're reading it, as you're processing it, here's what you want to look for. So Exodus tells us a few things about God. First, God reveals himself. That's the first thing we see, starting in the burning bush and then throughout it. In Genesis, God is there, but he's kind of vague. If all that you had was Genesis, you really wouldn't know much about God, would you? Who is he? What does he actually want? What is he like? We have the creation story, but otherwise there's some destruction and stuff, but there's some promises, but we don't really see much of God. Exodus, we now begin to make sense of him. Secondly, God rescues, God saves. The word Exodus means to be brought out of. This forms the basis of everything because right from the beginning here, we see it's about grace. Grace in the sense that God is giving something, and grace here is not earned, it's not deserved. God is just doing something because he wants to, because he loves us. The Israelites didn't earn rescue. They didn't even ask for it. They didn't even know who God was. He just did it. He initiates everything. And their entire story began when God saves them from their horrible circumstances. And this will be the backbone of their entire story, something they return to again and again, that they are people that were chosen, that God just wanted to do this for them, that God saved them. Therefore, we now see that God also wants to restore them. He doesn't just want to take them out of brokenness. He wants to help them become something different. So yeah, you're living in slavery and brokenness. It's more than just being slaves, though. It's now like we're trying to undo what was broken at the fall. We're trying to make you humans again, restore your humanity. And so what we'll see is this is the giving of the Torah, the law. We have at Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments. We'll see that. So God is restoring humanity by giving them his wisdom that they rejected at the Garden of Eden. The giving of the law was both us understanding God more for the first time since the garden, God's wisdom for life, but also understanding kind of him more and what he wants of us more, who we're supposed to be. The word Torah can mean this way, direction, this way to find life. So God saves, and then God restores, begins to heal and make new. And then God returns to his people. And this is, man, that's so big. It's not just about you being a different kind of person. It's about us being different kinds of people with God. We are created for relationship. And one of the greatest, most devastating impacts of the fall was not that we lost the paradise garden. We lost God's presence. But in Exodus, now he comes back to his people. His glory fills the tent, as we'll see. It's about so much more than just rules for living. It's people living with God, what was lost. And then, of course, the most important and obvious response is people complain and rebel. Remember what I said, a main theme of Genesis, faithfulness, it's the theme, right? God does all these amazing things and we're like, despite all God does, humans just can't seem to be grateful and accept and follow him, to respond to his grace the right way. This is the Israelite story. It's still ours today. So Exodus sort of sets the stage for what will be the entire rest of the Old Testament that we study together. All right, so those are the big ideas, the big themes. So let's talk about the way that Exodus is broken down as a structure, as you can read it. It can be tricky to read because Exodus breaks between narrative or story and then like lists of laws and then back and forth. But what you have to understand is it's all connected. What is really happening is a mix between the story of what happened with an explanation of the agreement, the contract they are making with God. This is all setting the groundwork for why. So what happened and the things God tells them to do are all connected. They're all related. They're all part of the same thing. It's like, here's the story of how we met, but here's also our vows. And here's the story of how we fell in love, but here's also the things that we loved most about each other and what we have to keep doing in order to stay in good relationship. It's all the same. It's all connected. And so I'm going to skip a lot of this law stuff, though, on this. We could get into it, but we're going to talk about it more in the video when we cover Leviticus, Deuteronomy. We'll talk more about law. In Exodus, I want to focus more on the story. So Let's do that. Let's break down the book of Exodus, walk through it, and show how it all breaks down. The first part of Exodus, part 1, is essentially the first 18 chapters. And it was what we call the Exodus narrative, the story of them being freed from slavery. We begin with a backstory explaining how at the end of Genesis, the descendants of Jacob with Joseph had grown a ton. The Egyptians actually make them slaves. They're now treating them harshly and ruthlessly, coming to the point where Pharaoh orders all the baby boys killed because he's tired of all these Hebrew people multiplying. This will come back to haunt him later. And you see that Moses was miraculously saved and raised in Pharaoh's own house. Ironic twist. But tries to defend an Israelite later in life, murders him, and then runs off into the desert where he spends most of his kind of adult life, almost 80 years, until, and that's the backstory, you come to this moment where God finally reveals himself at a burning bush. God speaks to him at this moment. And Moses comes to God and because of the bush says, "What is your name?" Which means what? Okay, I want to pause here and tell you a little bit about the ancient world. Now, when we talk about religion in the world of the Old Testament, the first and most important idea you have to wrap your mind around when talking this way is that this thing that we call religion, for most Americans, is like just a small part of your life, or maybe no part at all. If you're watching this video, it's probably a part of your life. It was foundational, though, to all human life and thought in the ancient world. It was understood quite differently from how you and I do today. First, for an ancient Near Eastern person living 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, there was no separation or distinction between science, religion, faith, reason, natural, supernatural. Those categories didn't exist. Everything was in some way related to the divine. Everything was about human existence tied to what we would call supernatural. It was all connected. For them, there was no distinction. It was all in one. All of life was religious because the gods were involved in everything. That's just the way the world worked in their understanding. There was no distinction. But this isn't exactly the same thing as what we today call religion. For us, religion is sort of a practice of dedication and worship, responding to God the way we think he wants us to in certain aspects of life. But for the ancients, everything was religion. Family, government, politics, farming, childbearing. There was simply no separation between everyday life and the working of the gods in their minds. So when we study this world, we have to be careful not to see it through our 21st century sort of Americanized ideas like religion, gods, angels, demons. Like they're sort of pie in the sky reality that some people believe and some people don't. No, everybody believed in gods. Everything was supernatural. The way they explained most of their world was through gods and deities. Everyone believed in it. There was no such thing as an atheist in the ancient world. Everything was tied to a higher power. So who were these gods? Well, the ancients understood their world as being governed by a multitude of celestial beings. Elohim is the Hebrew word. That could mean God. It could mean angel. It could mean spiritual, powerful force. These beings, though, were generally human-like, as we'll see, but more powerful. They were responsible for maintaining the world and guiding all human existence. The people believed that everything that happened, whether in nature or in life, were the work of these divine beings. And you served them in order to help them have stability and keep the world functioning properly. It was fundamentally their way of making sense of nature and life. So there was a god of the moon, the god of the sun, and the sun's god was to raise the sun. The moon's god was to raise the moon. Rain god brings rain, all these kind of things. And then what you had was different nations or ethnicity or people groups would have kind of a state god that maybe was their chief god, whereby the civic leaders paid special homage to. And normal people were not obligated to directly worship the state gods. They were actually too big and important to hear their measly prayers anyway. Instead, common people often had their own smaller family gods, ancestral gods, who they believed would take a special interest in them because their family gave them. This is where you get the phrase God of your fathers, whereby you would worship the same ancestral deity as your extended family did. And you would teach your children to do the same. In turn, you would ask your family special God to give you more direct help and bless you and prosper you and things like that. But check this out. Because there were so many gods, people were open to whatever anyone else believed. There was no such thing as faulty or wrong theology. When Jonah came to the Ninevites, they would have been open to the message of a foreign God being angry with them. They'd be like, oh, okay, fine. Well, your God's angry. What'd we do? There were all kinds of God. Sure. What does your God want from us? And all the gods had different reasons, different things they had to explain. And so you have this moment where Moses says, tell me your name. And in this moment, what Moses is saying is not like, hey, introduce yourself personally to me necessarily. He was basically saying, which God are you? What are you in charge of? I know moon god, and the Egyptians obviously know sun god. Amun-Ra was the chief god of Egypt. Which God are you? Who are you? And what does God say back to him? Yahweh says, my name is I am. Tell him I am sent you. Well, that's literally the verb to exist. So God is communicating to Abraham that his title, his name, his responsibility is everything, his existence. And so the idea is God is so much bigger than all their small little deities. Again, why? Remember going in the back of our story of Genesis? What's happening? What's happening with this story is God is revealing himself to be so much more and bigger than anything anyone imagined. So Moses confronted with, wow, your existence, God. I thought sun God was a big deal. You're a bigger deal. So Moses goes back to Egypt, tells his people and confronts Pharaoh. And God says, let my people go. God now wants to bring them out of Egypt and go back to the land of Abraham, where he promised his forefathers, and establish them and do what he promised Abraham. But it doesn't go well. Pharaoh makes things worse than the people. They're now upset. In chapter 6, we see a clear explanation from God how he had made a promise to Abraham, but never fully revealed himself the way he is now, sending Moses back to Egypt. And so you now have these plagues. And the first 9 all deal with Egyptian life and are all areas other gods of their time were in charge of. River, food, crops, livestock, weather, even children. And they grow progressively worse, from nuisance to death. Death of the firstborn, which is the most important in that culture. And the eldest took care of the parents, represented blessing. So all of these things that were central to Egyptian life, the one true God is showing power and dominance over, revealing himself. And then you get to this thing called the Passover, which is in order to escape the coming death. The Israelites were told to sacrifice an innocent lamb and wipe its blood over their doorpost. And the angel of death would literally pass over their house. And this blood of an innocent saves the people. Sound familiar? If you haven't taken New Testament survey yet, we'll get to that. They would continue to celebrate this every year during the festival of Passover, having a Seder meal that commemorates and remembers leaving in the middle of the night and being freed from slavery. And so then you have the literal exodus, the leaving. Pharaoh relents, the people are freed, they take all this treasure with them. Pharaoh changes his mind, comes after him. There's a famous sea of the parting, the Red Sea, and the miraculous power, and the people are saved. Many people say that later Jesus' baptism of going through the waters in the wilderness was similar to this. That's a side note. But then you have a 3-day journey, you come to a mountain. This is a big deal. At the mountain, we don't know where this is anymore, but God provides for them. He gives them food from heaven, water from a rock. And through all the people, all the time, the people can't stop complaining. It's all they do is grumble. And when they arrive at the mountain, Moses goes up to meet God. So all of this has now happened. They've now come to this mountain. Okay, we're here. Now what? And now the story shifts a little bit. Part 2, starting in chapter 20. You have this whole section of receiving of the law and the instructions of God. So Moses goes up in the mountain, meets with God, where he's given the 10 commandments and other rules that govern how God's people will treat him, commandment 1 through 4, and each other, commands 5 through 10, including a strict rule against worshiping any other gods or idols, which I want to pay attention to there. Notice the first commandment, have no other gods before me, doesn't say there are no other gods. You're like, what? He didn't go that. He would eventually reveal to them that they weren't really gods. The first command was just, I'm the only one, which was radical because they were all polytheists. They all worship lots of gods. The first thing was, I'm going to change your perception of what it means to honor me. You can't just worship me and other gods. I'm the only one you can worship. You got to cut all the other ones off. Worship no other ones. And then don't make an idol. Well, what's wrong with an idol? Well, an idol was a physical object that represented the god, and it was the thing that you sort of prayed to and took care of and tried to do things with in order to get the god's attention. And it's important to understand that the idol wasn't actually a god. Very people thought that a carved piece of stone was literally a god. They understood the idol to symbolize or stand in the place of the god, to be a gateway for the god's presence. It was sort of a mediator. And it created a way for humans to interact with the god. The image was the presence and the revelation to the people. They could worship the idol and feed it. They literally put him to bed and gave him food and sang to it and things. And I think what's important for understand is at the core of idol worship is this desperate attempt to get the god's attention. Like, I don't know where the gods are. They're distant. They're far away. They're other. I just need something from them. I want something. So I'm going to create this little idol and worship it and sing it and all this kind of stuff. And idols are like this opportunity to earn something. And the ancient believed that the gods had needs which humans could meet as a form of worship and honor and gaining favor. The gods were busy. They needed to be cared for so they could focus their energy and time, running the universe and stuff. So an idol served as a way for a human to help. It was considered our duty to care for the idol as a way of gaining their favor and helping them. And this is where things got intense. Idols were actually awakened in the morning. They were washed and clothed and fed 2 meals a day. They'd put food in front of them. They were entertained. They would be sung poetry and things and put to bed at night. They would dress up. You'd say a bunch of nice stuff to them. Give them expensive gifts and offerings, little doll things, all in an effort to get something in return. The idol became the point where they could do anything and everything in their power to try to earn brownie points in order to get the god's attention. Because again, that's what you needed. If my crops are dying, I need the gods to take care of them. I need rain. If I'm going to war, I need protection, right? If I want a baby, I need this goddess to give me fertility. So this is all an attempt to get the god's attention. But hold on. Here's Yahweh saying, you don't need to do that to get my attention. It was all arbitrary. Nothing was guaranteed. There's a great quote I found that talks about the overall Mesopotamian sentiment about worshiping gods in their culture. It says this: the divine was above all considered to be something inaccessible, dominating, and to be feared. I'm afraid of gods. They're not near me. People sought the gods for protection and assistance, not for friendship and relationship. People didn't think of gods that way. You honored and obeyed them because you feared them and you wanted something from them. And you were hoping that maybe they would see you or pay attention and give you what you needed. Half the time, you had no idea what they wanted anyway and would respond with whatever you could think of, usually by treating them the way you'd treat an arrogant king or something. But this God is different. There was no serving him with human hands. If you want something, just ask. If you want to be in a relationship, here he is. Idols represent the wrong view of who God is, and whereby we think we as people have some ability to control or manipulate or help God. He's not served by human hands. Instead, he simply gives because he loves us. And so he says, if you want things from me, if you want to be in a relationship with me, here, trust me, obey me, follow me. It'll go well for you. You don't need to do all that other nonsense. So he then gives specific instructions on how to build essentially a roaming temple called a tabernacle or a tent, where he says, I want to come and be with you. I want to live with you. I want to be in your presence. I don't want to be distant and feared and angry. This is a whole new understanding of God that nobody else in the ancient world had. And we'll come on to that more later. But while Moses is up there getting all this revelation from God, the people down below are going back to their old way of life. He's up on the mountain. The people get worried. They return to their old Egyptian way of thinking, and they create an idol that they can worship to so the gods can come down and save us. They make a bull, which their Egyptian storm god rode on top of a bull. And they're like, come God and come save us. They were going back to their old way of life. It's important to notice that it doesn't necessarily mean they're looking for another God. They might have actually thought this Yahweh God would come down and ride their bull. But it's an empty symbol of something a former way of life. The problem is they needed God to help them. They wanted something. And so their misconception was, let's do it the way we used to do it. Let's build an image. Let's engage in revelry. The gods must love it when we act stupid like little children. But the reality is God saves his people because he loves, not because we grovel. And that's the whole point. That's what he's getting at. That's what God wants to introduce. Like, I want you to see that I don't need all these things to love you. I just want you to trust and obey me. That's it. So God relents his anger, gives the people a second chance. His anger is probably more for their revelry, whichever that was, rather than the golden calf. But either way, we begin to see more about him. And then in chapter 35, you see kind of the last part of the book, where we're preparing the way of the Lord. You get more regulations on how to build the tabernacle, how to build it. And then in chapter 40, they finish it, and it says the glory of the Lord, the presence of God comes. He returns to his people, which is what they've been waiting for all this time. Like finally, God comes back to his people. And Exodus ends with God dwelling with us again, back in a paradise, going back to the land he promised with him. And however, though, there's a hint of a problem beneath the surface. Because even though all these amazing things have happened, God has shown, I don't want you to worship the way them. I want to be your only God. I'll give you everything you need. I'm all powerful. I provide all of your needs. You don't have to grovel. I just love you. I want to be with you. All you see then are whiny, unappreciative people prone to go back their old way of life. And that becomes the repetitive story, doesn't it? So what would happen? Well, we'll pick that up in our next book. as we continue to study the Old Testament together. We'll see you in the next video and continue studying the Old Testament together. Thanks, guys.